And I think sure carbon.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the discipline of Gender and Women's Studies in the School of Political Science and Sociology, it's my honor to welcome all of you to today's lecture by Professor Diane Elson. Today is International Women's Day, and International Women's Day originated in the struggles of women for equality, both political equality as well as economic equality, and were based on some of the most important labor struggles that were done in the early 19th century. So it is indeed extremely timely that in today's crisis of cost of living crisis, that we are going to speak about the implications, the gender implications of this crisis, and the importance of the struggle for political security, but also economic security, which is fundamental for any beginnings of change. And I'm very pleased to see our Deputy Vice President and Registrar, Paul Wahadati. He is standing in place for the President, who unfortunately was unable to come. So Paul, can I invite you to make a few remarks, and then I will introduce the speakers for today.
Thank you, Nata. And on behalf of the President, I just want to send apologies. He got his diary crossed and it's had to be somewhere else. So, and apologies, I've also rushed over just from something else for our intense named session. Look, International Women's Day. This university, you'll be aware of the history of this university and the difficulties and the challenges and the discrimination that took place in the past. And we are striving as best we can, and there's more to be done to address some of that historical legacy and to create a better environment going forward. One of the areas has been and was central, in fact, to the case that was won against this university in 2014 has been academic promotions. And we have a new scheme in place that has been there for 3 years, and we've had some success in that. But one of the things that comes out very clearly, for example, from the gender pay gap report, is that promotions alone won't address the issues that this university is facing and indeed the society is facing. What we are doing is at university management level and at all levels across the university trying to encourage, trying to support, and dare I say it, we possibly need to even be more radical. And within whatever legislative frameworks are there, perhaps even challenge some of those legislative frameworks and try and be more radical in how we address gender inequality. So that has the full support of the university, and I want to pay tribute to the work that both Anne Scott did as the country's first VP EDI when she was here, and also to the work that Helen Mayer is doing now with her colleagues in the EDI office in terms of promoting gender equality. So the steps, the aims, the idea that we should be achieving genuine respect and equality across gender, across all aspects of EDI is something that we as a university management team totally buy into and will strive to promote and strive to support as best we possibly can. I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to the discussion today, because what I do, if I know one thing in this life, it doesn't matter what the topic is, there are always plenty of people who know far more about it and can speak far more coherently about it than I can. Thank you.
Now, today's lecture is being given by Professor Diane Elson. To some of you, she is a household name, especially those of us who are in the area of feminist economics. She is one of the founding eminent feminist economists in the world today. For some of you, she's not known, And this is an opportunity to understand what feminist economics is and the type of work that feminist economists do. Professor Elson is Emeritus Professor at University of Essex and was the former chair of the UK Women's Budget Group, as well as the former vice president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. She has been an advisor to many UN agencies, high-level UN agencies, including being a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy, and has been an advisor to UNIFEM and UNDP, among many of the other organizations. But her role has been as a thinker and understanding some of the central issues of economic policy and the gender implications. And particularly some of the students in this today have read her work because she laid the foundation for thinking about the economic processes and how they affect women. And so in that sense, she is a really a pioneer and a groundbreaker. She has done an extremely important book along with two of her colleagues, which is on the radical potential of human rights. So as a feminist economist, she's not only interested in understanding economic policy, but is looking broader to understand how we draw in human rights and its potential to influence the kind of economic policy that will deliver social justice for all. And so I'm extremely pleased to invite Diane to give the lecture. And we also have two discussants, and I will introduce them as they come to speak.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you for inviting me back to NUI Galway to give this talk on International Women's Day. It's not the first time I've been here. I was external examiner for 4 or 5 years at the beginning of the program, Global Women's Studies, that some of you are students on at the moment. I'm really pleased to see how that's thriving. I was last here in 2016 for the annual conference of the International Association for Feminist Economics, overshadowed for me and many other people from the UK, because it was also the time when the Brexit referendum result came in. I will maybe refer from time to time in my talk about the appalling impact that Brexit has been having on the UK, on poor people in the UK, on equality issues in the UK. I'm honoured to be accompanied by two such distinguished discussants, from whom I look forward to learning a lot more than I know at the moment about the situation in Ireland. So let me turn. Right. So Nata asked me to talk about the crisis in the cost of living. And I want to put this in the context of it being a crisis of social reproduction being the system that depends so much on women's unpaid work, but also the non-market work of people in the public sector, like in universities, in hospitals, in schools, in raising generations of people, in taking care of them. We all need taking care of at some point in our lives, but also at providing a labor force for the economy. And the economy can't work unless social reproduction goes on. Often finance ministers think it'll just go on quietly in the background. We don't need to pay any attention to it. But I think we're at the moment of a point in crisis when social reproduction is falling apart and finance ministers are having to pay some attention. My presentation, I'm going to briefly speak about the global contours of the crisis in social reproduction. Then I'm going to talk about the UK case with particular examples from Scotland and from Northern Ireland. I'll say something about policies to address and end this crisis. And then the questions for discussion that I'm posing to all of you, it's what are the dimensions of the crisis in the Republic of Ireland and what policy responses are being considered here? And I'll be drawing on the work of 4 groups in the UK, in particular, the UK Women's Budget Group, which I'm a long-standing member, the Scottish Women's Budget Group, the Wales Women's Budget Group, and the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Groups. And these are all civil society organizations that bring together academics, they bring together trade unionists, they bring together women activists and women's organizations to scrutinize the budgets of the UK as a whole and of the devolved nations within the UK, and to present a critique of them and to put forward alternative policies. So they recently had a conference on the cost of living crisis in the UK and the devolved nations, and I'll be drawing quite a bit on the research that was presented there. First, it is a global cost of living crisis. So I want to situate what I'm saying about the UK and what we want to be discussing about Ireland in that global context. The supply chain bottlenecks caused by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine and by corporate behavior and climate change have pushed food and energy prices to an all-time high. You can see those figures there. Food prices expected by the World Bank to be 18% higher in 2022 than 21, whereas the energy 59% higher. So these are massive increases. And this soaring inflation is creating a real terms pay cut for many workers. Analysis by Oxfam International of wage data from 96 countries finds that in 2022, at least 1.7 billion workers lived in countries where inflation was outpacing wage growth. So they're all having a real terms pay cut. A global inequality crisis. So deeply embedded in this cost of living crisis is an inequality crisis, what some people are calling greedflation. Again, I'm referring to this great Oxfam report called The Survival of the Richest. They looked at the profits of some of the world's largest food and energy companies. And they found, as they say, eye-watering levels of windfall profits. 95 companies made windfall profits, found they made these huge £306 billion in windfall profits, and their profits were increasing more than 2.5 times in 2022 compared with the average for 2018-21. And they were paying these, they weren't plowing all these profits back into investments to improve the standard of living. They were paying a lot of it out to shareholders. 84% of their windfall profits directly to shareholders. And 76% of these companies increased their profit margins. So while it's a cost of living crisis for many, the soaring profits as greedflation is enhancing the fortunes of the very richest. And I was just reading this morning online about the way in which the European Central Bank has now started to recognize this issue of greedflation and just have reports saying, oh, it's not just wages that's a problem in this inflation, it's these profit margins of companies. And also the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, one of the members of that, is also making a speech yesterday, also pointing to this problem of the big corporations enhancing their profit margins, putting up their prices. But I don't hold my breath that this is going to change the policies of the Bank of England or the European Central Bank. We can talk about that a bit more if you want to in the discussion. Because the global policy response to these rising prices has been that central banks all over the world are raising interest rates. 80 central banks raised interest rates in 2022, of fighting inflation. The European Central Bank and the Bank of England, as do many central banks, aim for this magic 2% inflation target. But nobody can explain where did this 2% inflation target come from? Where is the research that says this is absolutely critical that you've got to get inflation to 2%? It's a number plucked out of the air. The interest rate rises are supposed to be necessary to combat a wage price spiral, but wages are not rising faster than prices. Instead, there's this profit price spiral. And interest rate rises are having negative impacts around the world. They're raising the debt service charges for governments. The least developed countries have a huge, huge debt crisis now because the interest they have to pay on their debts, substantial debts, have gone up. Businesses have to pay more, households have to pay more. And this risks creating recessions with a loss of jobs and less tax revenue, and it discourages new investment. There are other ways of discouraging price increases, such as selective credit controls and measures to reduce monopolistic power of the kind that's enabling these rises in the profit margins. But I don't see any governments anywhere yet telling their central banks, lay off the interest rate rises, we're going to try these other policies instead. There's also been a global policy response to rising prices in terms of cutting public expenditure. So I'm not going to read out all those numbers you can see on the screen, but you can see the research by Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummins has revealed a huge, almost all these governments around the world projected to cut public spending as a share of GDP, and plans to cut all the kind of programs that we might think are important for gender equality. And it's evident that it's now a crisis of social reproduction in many countries. Estimates from UNDP that pushing an additional 71 million people into poverty. The Human Development Index has declined. I mean, the first phase of that was due to COVID, but now it's being made worse because of the cost of living rises. Many people's capabilities are not being enhanced. They're being depleted. And this is set to get worse, I think, in 2023. Even the World Bank is admitting that it is a crisis in which the already devastating reversals in education, health, poverty, and infrastructure are set to get worse. Now, we often see these problems talked about in terms of what's happening to GDP. And we worried in Western Europe because this stagnation, the UK government is barely growing, the UK economy is barely growing, the Irish economy is barely growing, same in some other Western European countries. There's a lot of worry about stagnation among economists and in the financial press. But stagnation is the least of it, I think, because at least if the economy stagnates for a bit, there's always the potential that it will improve in 2 or 3 years' time, when we'll start to grow again. But losses in social reproduction, we can't assume that these are losses that we experience now that can be made good later on. As I'll show on some later slide, there's premature deaths. There's irreversible damage to health and skills. So I think what we've got now is a crisis of social reproduction in so many countries with these irreversible elements. That is not going to be that everybody lives will be improved year after next when growth returns to some countries, as it will. So it is an irreversible crisis for many. But it's also a gendered crisis. This crisis bears more heavily on women, especially low-income women in ethnic minorities, than it does on men for several reasons. Women are more likely to live in poverty and have lower levels of savings and higher levels of debt. Wages are lower, their incomes are lower. They're more likely to work in and rely on the public services that are being cut back in so many countries. women still have greater caring responsibilities than men and are called upon to increase their unpaid work when the public services are cut. And in families, women tend to have more responsibility than men do. The stressful day-to-day consumption decisions, heating versus eating, as we say in the UK. Are you going to switch on the central heating, or are you going to go to the store and buy some food? And it's very often women with children, especially, who have to make those really stressful decisions. And households are not safe places for so many women. The risk of domestic violence and financial abuse is always there in many households, but it tends to rise. The risks of this happening rise when you have something like a cost of living crisis. Arguments about money are one of the things that triggers domestic violence and financial abuse. And many women at the moment can't even afford to leave an abusive situation. Let me now say a little bit specifically about the UK. The overall rate of inflation was about 10% at the end of last year, a bit higher, I think, than in Ireland and in most of other Western European countries. Brexit is an important contributing factor to this, because Brexit has meant a fall in the value of the pound. And that means everything that's imported costs more in terms of pounds, and a lot of food and energy is imported into the UK. At the moment, we have the government providing, perhaps they do in Ireland too, a kind of subsidy to cushion households against the worst of the rises in the cost of energy. I won't go into all the details of that. That is set to come to an end at the end of April. There's a lot of lobbying now for next week when the Chancellor of the Exchequer presents the new UK budget, that he will extend this for at least till the middle of the summer, because otherwise a lot more households are suddenly going to find their hit directly by these large bills. And we have a crazy situation in the UK where poor people who are in debt to energy companies must pay more per unit for their energy than better off people who are not in debt. And that's because the energy companies force them to install something called a prepayment meter. And if you have a prepayment meter, you have to pay more per unit of energy. Food prices, huge increase in food prices at the moment, 16.7% in January. And again, it's the basic products at supermarkets, the own brand products that low-income families have been relying on, their prices have gone up more than the average rise in food prices. So poor households and women trying to make the budget stretch between the heating and the eating are particularly hard hit. The interest rate increases have been adding to the cost of living increases. Like you've experienced, I think the European Central Bank, plus the Bank of England, raising the interest rate, increasing mortgage payments to millions of people, rents in the private sector increasing because landlords have taken out mortgages to buy the properties they're renting out. Now, households at the top of the income distribution will benefit because they're going to get higher interest on their savings. But what's going to happen to a lot of other people is that they will be plunged more into debt. These falling real incomes in the UK mean that many have been hungry and cold this winter. This winter is still going on as we feel if we step outside the door. The median household incomes have fallen by 3% in real terms, 2022, 23. And there was a big survey, which I'll talk again in another slide about, a big survey of 10,000 adults in November 22 that found this big rise in the number, the proportions of people who couldn't afford to switch on the heating when they were cold, who couldn't afford to eat because they lacked enough money to buy food. But at the same time, executive pay and City of London bonuses in the financial sector have been soaring. And as I said earlier, the profit margins have been rising. Falling real spending on public services in the UK. I won't go through all the data on this slide. The allocations to the public sector services have not been uprated in line with inflation. So the schools are in crisis now. They've got higher costs, they have got more money. They're going to have to make teaching assistants redundant or reduce their hours of teaching assistants to balance their books. In the NHS inflation, the National Health Service really suffering already because of years of austerity and cutbacks since 2010, but again, not having their allocations uprated in line with inflation, and irreparable damage. It's estimated that an extra 1,000 people a week are dying, not counting the COVID deaths. An extra 1,000 people a week are dying, with up to half of these attributed to delays in the accident and emergency departments at hospitals, because the health service is so short of staff and so short of resources. Lots of strikes going on in the public sector, teachers, 76% women, health service staff, 80% women are on strike in England as the government refuses to raise the well below inflation pay increases that they've been awarded. My own union, the University and Colleges Union, has also been striking, not only for pay, but deterioration of pensions and deterioration of working conditions. Been a surprising amount of public support for the striking workers, especially in the health service. Public sector pay in November 2022 was rising only at 3.3% on average, whereas in the private sector, pay was rising at 7.2%. So some people have been having improvements to their wages, but not in the public sector, where women, so many of the workers are women, vast majority in some parts of the public sector, and women rely so much on services like health and education in managing their care responsibilities. So how are different people in the UK affected by the cost of living crisis? There was this big online survey of 10,000 adults, which I mentioned. It's really useful to commission a survey like this. They reported the results, though, by household income, by age, by ethnicity, by employment status. And lots of adverse impacts. They did not report the results by gender. And I don't know whether you have this problem in Ireland, but we do in the UK. A lot of these big surveys, either they're conducted on a household level and they never disaggregate what's happening to different people in the household, or even if they survey individuals, somehow they don't think of asking questions about possible gender differences. And I think in the end, that's because at root, they still have this notion that all income in households is pooled and shared. And that's what households are. Households are mechanisms, are institutions for pooling risk, for sharing resources. We say that's true of some, but there are lots and lots where it's not. However, there is, therefore, if we want direct evidence on gendered impact, we can't turn to these big surveys. They just don't reveal. The best you can do is find out what's happening to single parents compared with families with two parents, and then say, yeah, but 90% of these single parents are women. So if they're being particularly hard hit, then women are being particularly hard hit. But direct evidence about the gendered impact of the crisis, we have to go to smaller scale studies done by sociologists, done by anthropologists, done by social activists. And we have to collect data from bigger organizations that are focusing on particular issues, like food poverty, like period poverty. And the Women's Budget Group gathered together a lot of data from wherever it could to do a briefing paper on the gender dimensions of the cost of living crisis. So they found the Food Standards Agency had been doing surveys and found that 49% of lone parents, most of whom are women, versus 31% of coupled parents with children, have cut down the size of their meals or skipped meals because they didn't have enough money to buy food. And even in those coupled parents, very often it's the women who eat the least. So we want to make sure that the children get fed, that the male partner gets fed, and then if there's any left over, they'll eat. Period poverty, a survey by Care International found that's got worse because especially young women can't afford to buy period products. And Women, Office of National Statistics found that women were less able to manage an increase in energy bills than men because of women's lower incomes. Now I'm going to turn to some more detailed case study evidence from Scotland and from Northern Ireland. There's a study by the Scottish Women's Budget Group and the Poverty Alliance covering August to October 2022. Semi-structured interviews, 38 diaries, low-income women, spread of different age groups, ethnicities, locations, and household types. They asked about coping strategies. They found all of these coping strategies I've listed up there. Coping strategies, when I read this, it took me back to when I was doing research in the late 80s and early 90s on the crisis in developing countries as they coped with debt crises and the same policies of raising interest rates and of cutting public expenditure. Those coping strategies exactly what research found in Latin America, what research found in Asia, what research found in Africa. Experiences. And people being women have the opportunity to speak about their personal experiences. Deepening poverty, hunger, cold, indebtedness, but also guilt, shame, and stigma, which is hard to tease out if you're just doing a survey questionnaire. You can't really put on the questionnaire, "I know you're feeling shame." You have to tease that out in a semi-structured interview or a focus group or diary. And just one quote that really struck me is from a Black lone parent mother in Scotland. Not being able to afford the essentials of life can be very stressful and robs women of their dignity and their self-worth. Then there was also a study presented at this conference I mentioned on women's experience of indebtedness and the cost of living crisis in Northern Ireland. A study by the Women's Regional Consortium, again, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, particularly women in the poorer and rural areas of Northern Ireland. These women were already having to turn a lot to borrowing to cover the essentials in early 2022. More than half of them had debts of over £1,000. And the rises in the cost of energy and food were impacting on the debt of 60% of the women. Much of the debt was at high rates of interest from both legal and illegal sources, including paramilitary groups. Their debt collection methods are not going to be very pretty. And 60% of women were struggling to repay. This debt was having a negative impact on their health, panic attacks, sleeplessness, anxiety, and the stigma was attached to the debt. They were ashamed of it, and they felt that debt was a trap that now they were going to find it really hard to escape from. I've started off in a cycle of debt with doorstep loans I'm not going to get out of. They should do something to help clear people's debts so they can start with a clean slate, they were saying. There's also evidence that in the UK, that the cost of living crisis is preventing women from fleeing domestic abuse. A Women's Aid survey in summer last year, small-scale survey, mainly in England, but some people in the other parts of the UK, a variety of ages, ethnicities, and financial links with their abuser. More than a fifth said the perpetrator of the abuse had used the cost of living crisis to further control their access to money. More than a third said the cost of living crisis had either prevented them from leaving or made it harder for them to leave. And one said, I feel like my only option to keep my kids is to go back to the marital home where he nearly killed me. I think this is a crisis of social reproduction. This is a crisis in which people don't easily recover. And this what gets left out in a lot of the surveys done by big organizations and done by Office of National Statistics. The link between the cost of living crisis and the intensification of domestic abuse and difficulties in dealing with it. At the same time as, of course, as public expenditure cuts to organizations like Women's Aid that are providing services and support for women who've been trying to leave abusive situations. Really shocking data on adverse impact on maternal health in the UK. The WHO has warned that the UK's cost of living crisis may increase the maternal death rate during or after pregnancy. Maternal mortality is already high in the UK, 3 times higher than in Norway. The UK's Care Quality Commission has noted a concerning decline in women's experience with maternity services due to staff shortages. These expenditure cutbacks in the health service for a long period. And of course, Brexit has intensified this because, not surprisingly, a lot of medical staff from other EU countries who were working in the UK decided to go back home after Brexit. Mothers who live in the most deprived areas much more likely, twice as likely to die as those in the more affluent areas. And then a poll of women, 500 women by the Maternal Mental Health Alliance, found that there was a negative impact on the mental health of new mothers because of cost of living concerns, much higher, 72% now compared with 30% who'd had their baby 18, 24 months ago. And the cost of living affects women's ability to access those services that there are. It affects their ability to travel to appointments. And something I hadn't thought of, it also is a barrier to them accessing care at home. They fear that a health visitor who comes to their house will judge them adversely if the home is not heated. It's that shame and stigma again. And so they refuse a visit, even if one is available. So it's a bleak picture, I think. Many people, particularly low-income women, hungry and cold, children hungry and cold, domestic abuse, the risk of domestic abuse rising, maternal health, maternal mortality increasing. Now, that's something you don't come back from. When you've died, you've died. And no matter if the economy starts growing again, it's not going to help you. So what kind of policies are the women's budget groups in the different parts of the UK and other organizations putting forward to address this crisis of social reproduction? In the first instance, in the short run, increase incomes and reduce personal debt. There are very quick ways of increasing income by increasing welfare benefits, which the government in London deliberately did not raise in line with inflation, although it will be doing so in April. Devolved governments have used some of their very limited fiscal capacity to introduce some mitigatory reforms, both in Northern Ireland, for instance, in Wales and in Scotland. A little bit of money that they do have discretion over, they've used it to increase the value of some of the welfare benefits or introduce new ones. Of course, we're also arguing for an increase in public sector pay, ideally to match inflation, but definitely substantial increase. Interesting piece of work by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which calculated that this is a choice, if the government chooses to end cut in fuel duty, that's factored into the forward budget projections, that would raise £6 billion. That would be enough to pay the NHS and the teachers a raise around the rate of inflation. So this is a choice. We'll see next week when the budget's presented on Wednesday what choice the Chancellor is making. It's not true that it's impossible to afford increasing public sector pay. It depends on the choices you make, particularly about the choices about taxation. And also in the short run, something I've only just begun to think about is reducing the burden of household debt. Because, policies that are introduced in the name of reducing public debt, like cutting public expenditure, actually are having the impact of increasing private debt, especially the debt of the poorest households, the debt of the poorest women. We have a crazy situation in the UK where a lot of poor people are in debt to the benefit agency because you have to wait 5 weeks. If you make a claim, a new claim for benefits, you have to wait 5 weeks to get it. Well, with the prices going up the way you are now, you can't afford, you have no cushion, you can't afford to wait for 5 weeks. So they will very kindly, the benefit agency will give you a loan, but then it will claw back that loan once you started getting your benefit. A lot of people are in debt to the benefit agency. Government can easily just stop that straight away and cancel those debts. There are also things that can be done about regulating doorstep loans, payday loans, to caps on fees and charges. So I think there needs to be a lot more attention to how can we reduce, cancel, make more manageable the debts of the poorest. But in the longer run, public investment to create what we in the women's budget groups in the UK call a green and caring economy. We need public investment to insulate houses. We have very poor insulation of our houses in the UK. The houses are incredibly energy inefficient. Renewable energy, more wind, more solar. We're doing well in Scotland on the wind. We need to do better in other parts of the UK. And then increase funding for investment by raising taxes on personal wealth. 5 policies that could raise £37 billion in tax is the name of this blog, and I've put there the numbers. Equalize capital gains with income tax rates, because at the moment, if you make a capital gain on your assets, you pay less on it than if you get a wage rise. Apply national insurance, which is what funds things like the pensions and the health service, to investment income. You don't have to pay it on investment income, only on earnings. A wealth tax on assets over 10 million, and inheritance tax loopholes, which benefit the wealthy, and reform the rules on non-dom status. Non-dom status is you pretending you aren't really living in the UK and you're living in Monte Carlo or somewhere like that, and avoiding paying taxes. There is plenty of money in the UK, but too much of it is in the hands of the rich who are not experiencing this crisis. The crisis is much more experienced by low-income people. And we've done a report in the UK Women's Budget Group called A Green and Caring Economy, which sets out more comprehensively and more globally as well, a set of policies with public investment in a green and caring economy at the heart. So now I'll come to the end of what I wanted to say about the global situation, about the UK situation, and many things you might want to raise in the discussion. I hope I've said something as well about the problems of research methods and of data, if we want to look particularly at the gender dimensions of the crisis and the limitations of what we get from official statistics, and even some of the progressive think tanks who commissioned this big survey, for instance, about the cost of living crisis, but then did not report any results by gender. And then the kinds of research that small-scale studies by women's organizations using more sociological, anthropological methods, which are the ones that can get more to the experience. What's the experience of this crisis? How are people managing this crisis? Who's having to bear the pressures of, can you feed your children? Can you send them to school in a new school uniform? Can you keep them warm in winter? And then some ideas about the policies that it's not rocket science. I think it's clear that there are policies. The issue is how can you get a change in the political situation and in people's understandings of what is possible to bring those about. So to tell people, for instance, when the Bank of England says, oh, we have no choice, but we've got to raise the rate of interest because of inflation, or the government says, oh, we have no choice, it's not affordable to increase spending on the public services, that these are political choices, there are alternatives. And the data that economists so often look at, a lot of it leaves out, I think, the depth of this crisis of social reproduction. So now I'm wanting to hear about your experience in the Republic of Ireland, what kind of research is going on here, what kind of policy responses. And so I'm looking forward very much to hearing from the two respondents and from the discussion.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to first, Diane, thank you so much for the extremely comprehensive lecture, laying out the crisis and also pointing some of the potential policies that we should be thinking about. It's also very important that it's important not to give the medicine that's going to kill the patient, because that's what seems to be happening, is that currently governments are implementing responses that are most likely killing the patient. So with that, I now turn to Dr. Shana Cohen, who's the director of TASK, the think tank for action on social change, as well as Owen Reddy, who is the executive director of the ICTU, Irish Confederation of Trade Unions, to give their responses to Diane's questions. What's happening in Ireland? I'm also looking forward to hearing. Hannah, may I invite you first?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you for, can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm actually really honored to be a respondent to Professor Ellison. I'm just going to give a brief introduction of TASK. I'm going to guess that a lot of people don't know what TASK is. I've been director of TASK since 2017, and I came from the UK. I actually did a lot of research in the areas that were just spoken about, how austerity affected low-income households. And unsurprisingly, it was mostly lone parents who were affected. Well, it was primarily lone parents affected the worst. And that would not be very different from what is happening here. TASK is an independent think tank, though most people in the media, if you've ever seen us referenced, we would be the union-friendly, union-backed, progressive lefty think tank. But actually, politically, we're independent. So we talk to everybody, but I'd say that exception of the far right. You probably don't want to talk to us. We do research, we do policy-oriented research. In fact, right now, my colleagues are in front of the Budget Oversight Committee talking about some of these issues. We do work with unions, quite a lot, I'm about to mention that. But we also work with corporations, but in general, our work is focused on inequality in democracy. We have different substreams of climate justice and social inclusion and health, and gender is a big issue. And I will just give you a brief, very 30-second overview of that, just to justify that I may know what I'm talking about. We have done, for instance, we work with Safe Ireland, and was very struck by what you said, because we've worked with Safe Ireland for a couple of years on economic control and financial abuse. And it comes up repeatedly. Does everybody know what Safe Ireland is? It's the national organization working with domestic violence. There are two sides to that story. You can't afford to leave because you don't have independent resources, and you've been told repeatedly that you are too stupid and incompetent to leave. And that becomes part of your mentality. And you think, well, I'll never make it on my own anyway, because I've been told repeatedly that I'll never make it on my own. So we have just partnered, we've done a report, which is still yet to be published, on economic control and what policies need to do about it. But also we deliver something called financial resilience training that has been funded by the Irish Banking and Culture Board on training Safe Ireland staff how to help their service users, victims of domestic violence, and how to believe that actually they can take control of their finances and they don't have to believe what the perpetrator has said about their abilities, and that they can see a trajectory toward financial empowerment to put their lives back together again. We've been doing that for about a year, but other of our other projects, they consistently touch on gender equality, including with low-paid migrant workers, which are often in healthcare or childcare or social care or any kind of care. You'll find a lot of migrant female workers who are low-paid, may not be unionized, and they are in temporary to precarious position. So in fact, if you look at the precarious workforce in general in Ireland, you'll find that it is dominated by women. And even in the university sector, it is the temporary, contracted, part-time faculty that are predominantly women. And they may choose that because they have small children, but you get into this cycle of you can't escape being a part-time, temporary, precarious worker. And I can tell you that from personal experience. Anybody want to talk to me about it? I got 2 kids. I can tell you all about it. So it has been a long struggle just to get to full-time work. And then we've done a report on care economy, and our last annual report on inequality was on the cost of living. So we are very involved in these issues. Now in Ireland, in contrast to the UK, I'd say, except for the recent trend under austerity and what's happening to the NHS, there are 2 things going on. The first is Ireland's model in general, which is reliant upon cash transfers and not investment in public services. And the second is this low-wage economy that is, again, very gendered. So what's happening is that the contradictions between what the orthodox thinking, as you put it, like we have to save money, like the 5 billion from last year in revenue from Ireland is reliant upon, I'm sure you all know this, the 10 multinationals for its corporate tax revenue. And everybody keeps saying, please don't do that. That's not a good approach. You need to diversify your tax base. But we're reliant upon American multinationals. So, but they put that money aside, it's the rainy day fund. But the problem is the contradictions between not investing in public services and saving money. That orthodox thinking is undermining social reproduction. And you're right, you can't erase the damage that's done from the lack of social reproduction, the lack of a foundation. The next is, again, the reliance on transfers. Now, what those transfers do is they make Ireland look good. They're right in the middle of the EU in terms of market inequality rates, okay? So actually, if you look at our Gini coefficient, or you look at sort of after the transfers, we do okay with inequality rates, but it's reliant upon those transfers. How many of you, know what child benefits are here? They're actually pretty generous. I can tell you from personal experience, they're better than the UK's child benefits. I have personally relied upon child benefits on a monthly basis to get by. But I would rather have better access to healthcare and not have to pay for private healthcare. So access to affordable childcare. I thank the Lord every day that I did not have small children here, because I don't know if I could have found adequate childcare. I had it in the UK. And it's not just that, it's can you, do you have transportation to go to work? Because you might be reliant upon public transportation. In Ireland, there's also, going back to the multinationals, there's a division between high and low paid workforce. So there's the high paid workforce that is working for the multinationals or in high tech. And then there is the low paid workforce that works in tourism, agriculture, and care. And again, it's that model. How do you bridge those sectors? How do you create more of a vibrant domestic economy that is competitive, where we, manufacturing or whatever industries you want to go into, rather than relying upon that low paid workforce, which again is gendered. And there's a general data collection issue in Ireland across different areas. We find constantly in our work, because we're relying upon government generated data. Some of it is they report on gender, but a lot of it, they don't even report gender, ethnicity, age. It's that we don't have the data to make the analysis. And then there are the gaps in public services. And it's not just public services, it is also where the public services are located. So if you are born in Donegal, then to go to get adequate healthcare, you might have to come to Dublin. I remember I went to go get a procedure, and the guy who drove me to the hospital said, yeah, I just drove somebody who had to come from Donegal for the procedure in Dublin. Think about the cost, because there's a hospital, like the Beacon Hospital is a hospital. There's a hotel right next to the Beacon Hospital in Dublin, because you have to come and stay at the hospital in order to get the procedure. So you don't have access to community-based or local healthcare, and you might not have access to community-based childcare either. So there's gaps in public services, and there are gaps in social housing. Today, there's a big debate about the eviction, right? The eviction ban. I'd love to know, speaking of data, how many women, especially lone parents, are going to be affected by the repeal of the eviction ban. I can understand the landlord's position. They're going to be like, well, they're not paying, I have a right to evict them. But how many women are they affecting who are either not in work or in low paid work and are lone parents? Now, I'm just going to go quickly through some data, and then I'll wrap up. So this is the problem with the reliance on transfers rather than services. So if you can look in Ireland, which is right at the top, so you can see cash benefits, the blue, and then the orange is services, and then tax breaks. You can see that Ireland is much more reliant than other EU countries on cash transfers. Have some cash, you're no longer poor, but we're not going to invest in public services. Pressure, it's not just the bottom decile, the bottom 10%, it's more than that. It's being lower or lower middle income in Ireland where you feel the pressure. Look, the top 5, those are the Scandinavian countries. Then there you have the EU average. But you look here, this isn't good. Because it's 3, they do okay. Okay, we're not that bad in terms, we're okay in terms of percentage of income, but it's these deciles too that are suffering economic pressure much more than the model, although Sweden, I'd say, is not going in the right direction for the EU, the Scandinavian countries. So there's pressure if you're below, if you're not sort of upper middle income in Ireland, you're feeling it. This is the bottom 40%. COVID supports. So again, speaking of like the supports that are in place now, like the energy subsidy, they help prevent the risk of falling into poverty. But you can see how important those supports were during COVID for preventing people from falling into poverty. That's a striking statistic, almost half. Okay. But the measures, which shows the effectiveness of intervention, helped decrease the risk of falling into poverty. Now this isn't very clear. I was trying to do my visuals. So this is a pressure on low income lone parent families, which unsurprisingly are predominantly women. So if you look at, these are from One Family, which is a charity that helps families. 1 in 4 families with children in Ireland is a one parent family. These are, I won't go through all the statistics. Almost 90% are headed by a woman, okay? In 2022, almost 75% of one-parent families, going back, the majority women, had at least some difficulty in making ends meet. This is, this is parallel to the UK, right? In 2022, you could say almost a quarter, fifth, had trouble keeping the home adequately warm. So you can imagine lone parent mother in a cold house, up from 7.9% the year before. So we're going in the wrong direction. You can imagine what the statistics for 2023 are going to be like. So one-parent families are more than 3 times as likely as 2-parent households to be unable to heat their homes. Okay. Housing, same problem. Single adult households, housing costs are heavy burden. Again, more than 2 adult households. This is the worst statistic. If you're going to talk about social reproduction, children of the age group most likely to be living in enforced deprivation. 20% of persons aged under 18 were living in enforced deprivation compared to 10% age 65 or over. So what kind of society where if you're over 65, you're okay, but if you're under 18, there's a good chance you're not. So that's not the kind of future that you want to be laying down. You want to make sure that you're investing in the future, and the future is you, right? Most of you in this room. Okay, it's not, or my kids who are, one is 18 and one is 16. So you want to make sure that they're going to be okay and that they don't grow up feeling financial stress as part of their childhood. Again, all this, one-parent family is likely to be renters. It's much more difficult financially to be a renter, unable to afford clothes, which is a basic necessity. And, again, you could have hygiene poverty, period poverty, and that your lone parents are statistically less likely to hold advanced degrees. And that becomes a vicious cycle, right? You don't have enough money to go back. You have to stay in work. You can't go back to education. So you can't advance, and you're more likely to be vulnerable to poor management, exploitative practices, because you need to hold on to that job, right? So going back to domestic violence, one of the problems that victims of domestic violence that we found in that project is that they're harassed at work, and more likely to be harassed after they leave the relationship. So we need sort of training, not just gender equality, but how to support women who have young children, who are lone parents, and who might have come from or be in an abusive relationship. So adults with 0 market income. As you can see, it's more women than men, especially women with a lower education, following on from what I just talked about. If you are a woman, low income with lower levels of education, most likely you're not going to have a market. All right, I'm just going to do this as a brief example, then I'll finish. Just to give an example of how public services are failing women, childcare costs for a 2-parent household in Ireland were amongst the highest in the OECD. 2020, this is couples again, so we're not talking about lone parents. Couples with the primary earner on 67% of the average wage paid almost a quarter of their income on net childcare costs. So, but look, compared to Austria, 10%, Belgium, 3% and 9%. So we're, if you have children in Ireland, unless you've got a really happy grandmother who's going to take care of your kids, you might, you're not, how are you going to cope? So and if you have to move for a job, how are you going to cope if your mother or your parents, the grandparents live in another city? So the government is, to its credit, trying to do something about this, but it's, is it going to be enough and fast enough? Okay, so just to finish up, the other, sorry, I'm spelling mistake. Can you see that? Okay, so anyway, it's just to finish up, the women are the proportionate part of the dominant part of a low-paid workforce. But I thought this is striking. This is from the low-paid older workers report from the Low Pay Commission. Women comprise 54% of the total low-paid employee population, and it doesn't change over the course of their lifetime. Yeah, that's what's striking. You don't get, you're still under 50, over 50. You're still going to be the majority of the low-paid workforce. And the risk is that you're going to have a continued impact on children, gender equality, and related effect. It's not just your unequal pay, but it's also on your health, well-being, your mental health, and your physical health. So that, I just want to wrap up there rather than go through policy, because I figured that Owen would focus on that, the policy responses. Thank you.
I apologize for this slide, but we're doing a survey on long COVID impacts of staff and students in NUI Galway to helpfully to give UMT some important policy suggestions. So that's why this slide is up. And so those of you who have a phone, haven't done this survey, please show your phone and click on the QR code. Thank you. Owen, sorry for
No
that.
problem. Hello. Thank you very much, Nada, for the invitation to be here. And it's very good to be here in Galway on International Women's Day, a very important date in the trade union calendar. We have our own seminar, All Ireland Seminar in Dundalk later this month to celebrate the day. I want to welcome Professor Elson's presentation. I think she really hits the nail on the head of a lost decade in the UK, of austerity, of cuts to public services, of perhaps rule by the most reprehensible and irresponsible Tory government, certainly in the last 40 years. You've had cuts to public services, you've had below inflation pay increases over the last 10 years in the UK. Then you have a COVID-19 pandemic, a cost of living crisis, and unprecedented industrial action and strike action in the UK. And I don't think it's a surprise. And we in the Congress of Trade Unions, which is the All Ireland Federation for Workers in Ireland, we understand it very well because about a quarter of our members in the All Ireland Congress are based in Northern Ireland. I spent the last 6 years myself working out of Belfast with our 200,000 workers across our 24 unions there. And I don't think we have a public servant in Northern Ireland at the moment who hasn't either been balloted for strike action or isn't considering strike action over the next period. We're quite a unique federation because we represent workers in Europe and outside Europe, tragically, with Brexit, as Diane has mentioned. But I think it's very interesting that if you look at Britain and you look at Northern Ireland, and you look at the level of strike action and industrial action, and then you look at the relative level of industrial peace in the Republic of Ireland, and maybe that's something that might come up in the Q&A because it's something that deserves a little bit more consideration. I think it's quite striking. Living crisis, not that radically different, but industrial peace here, industrial chaos and action there. I think Diane really captured the crisis of social reproduction as well, and those two kind of failing go-to positions that many governments do, which is to cut public services and to reduce the public spend, which is a wrong thing to do, and to increase interest rates, which hits workers in particular and disproportionately women workers in a very, very severe way. And I think it's really important that we, and you hear people say this a lot, we need to learn the lessons of the pandemic, and there are many. But the one big lesson I think we need to learn in Ireland and in the UK is that if we want the state to be the defender of last resort for society, for workers, for businesses, for citizens, well, we need to resource it properly. And a tragedy that the UK and Ireland share, there are a few, but one of them is that we spend, and we have a history of spending less per head of population compared to other wealthy European countries. And Ireland's a wealthy country, as is the United Kingdom. But the real tragedy is when it comes to tax. We did a piece of work recently with the Nevin Economic Research Institute. It showed that workers working in the Republic of Ireland pay about 97–98% in income tax compared to other wealthy European countries. We pay European taxes. Do we have European services? Listening to Shanna, you can see clearly that we don't. Workers in the UK pay about 67% of wealthy EU country taxes. And we know that workers who earn over 100 grand a year in the UK could pay a bit more. Remember the chaos of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng? Well, they wanted those workers to pay a lot less. As Diana said, there's a lot of wealth in the UK, but some people aren't paying their fair share. But the real inequity is when it comes to what employers pay. We found that employers in the Republic of Ireland, when it comes to PRSI, pay as little as 48% as their peer employers in wealthy European countries. And in the UK, it's even worse, it's 41%. If we bridge that gap, and only to get to European norms, nothing radical here, just to get to the average, it would mean another 9 billion in public spending for the Irish government and a whopping 121 billion pounds for a UK government. That's just to get to the EU norm. So what do we as a trade union movement in Ireland advocate to address the cost of living crisis? It's a twin track approach for us. It's two things, and one without the other won't work. The first one is more collective bargaining. More collective bargaining in the workplace at sectoral level and at national level, in particular for the public service, and an increase in what we call the social wage, our public investment. Touching on collective bargaining first, in Ireland, we need to make it easier for workers who want access to a union to be in a union. We don't do that currently. We need to make it easier for workers to get the benefits of collective bargaining agreements. And there's two very exciting initiatives and instruments at our disposal over the next year or two. There's a Labour Employer Economic Forum high-level group report on collective bargaining, a bit of a mouthful, but the Labour Employer Economic Forum is a tripartite body of trade unions, employers and government looking at labour market issues. I know from talking to our sister organisation, the TUC, they don't have anything like that. There's no dialogue between the current disreputable British government and the trade union movement, and look at the strikes that they have there. We have dialogue, we don't have enough, we don't have enough impact, but at least we have something. And that working group, that body has said, we need to make collective bargaining easier for workers at sectoral level and also at firm level. And we're going to legislate for that in the next 12 months. The second thing is a European Union instrument. Again, tragically, the UK will not get the benefits of this because they're outside of Europe. It's called the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive, quite a radical directive. And its ambition is to get collective bargaining coverage, the proportion of workers covered by a collective agreement, up to 80%. In Ireland, currently, it's about 35%. We're 19th in the league table of 27 member states. Long, long way to go. But if we can increase collective bargaining coverage and union membership and increase pay, quite frankly, we will improve our equality challenges. And we need to focus on that in 23-24. Second point, increasing the social wage. Well, what are we talking about? We're talking about making our public services more affordable and more accessible to citizens who need it. But obviously we need to resource it. So health, education, public transport. The government have started to do a few things, but nowhere near enough. One-off measures for students when it comes to registration, having public transport for 12 months. We need to see more of that on a long-term sustainable basis. That goes back to the point of resourcing the state. And of course, housing, the existential crisis of this generation. And Shanna mentioned the eviction ban that the government, I think, disgracefully ended yesterday. If you're going to do something like that, you do it when you have a policy to replace it. And we know that low-paid workers, single-family workers are going to be disproportionately affected by that decision. So we need to see more of a social wage for everybody. But when it comes to the cost of living crisis, we need to see more targeted resourcing. There was a situation in the last 2 years where many of the benefits were going to people who, quite frankly, didn't necessarily need it, and not enough to those who did need it. So more targeted resources. We want to see welfare rates indexed with pay and with inflation. So we're pushing this agenda at the Labour Employer Economic Forum, and we're making some progress, but not enough. The forum's not robust enough, but it is a lever that we have that the unions in Britain don't have. Looking at the gendered nature of the cost of living crisis, I mean, it's a simple thing to say, but it's quite striking. Why in this society do we put such a low value on the people who look after our most vulnerable citizens, our children and our senior citizens? The bell curve of our life, you know, early years and elder years. Is it any surprise that overwhelmingly that workforce are female? I think if overwhelmingly that workforce was male, the situation would clearly be different. And just to conclude, I want to talk about two areas, childcare, but more from the worker point of view, because we did a piece of work in Northern Ireland in the last few years looking at childcare. We found that there's 10,000 childcare workers in Northern Ireland. 98% of them are women. No surprise there. In Northern Ireland, about 28% of workers, just less than 3 out of every 10, earn below the real living wage. But in childcare, it's 1 and 2. Again, no surprise, because they're women, and that gendered nature, that inequality that is embedded in our society and in our economy. No collective bargaining, and childcare costs are incredibly high. In the Republic of Ireland, Shanna's put some stats up there. We have had decades of underinvestment in childcare. You know, for many working parents, it's been more than the mortgage in the last 20 years. We are starting to see, and it's belated, but it's welcome, a bit of investment in it. We need to see a lot more. We're starting to see childcare workers organising. To had a really good campaign, the Early Years campaign, where childcare workers now have what's called a joint labour committee, and where they're bargaining with employers and trying to professionalise their sector and get decent pay increases. But the last point I would make, and it comes back to the times we have lived through, the pandemic, and on top of that, the cost of living crisis. And it's not a surprise that we have seen an increase in domestic gender violence, tragically, in the home in many instances over the last 4 years. Two things that have happened that we've been working on north and south. In Northern Ireland, we've seen a very progressive bill, the Domestic Abuse Safe Leave Bill. Former MLA, tragically, she didn't get re-elected. Rachel Woods, a Green MLA in North Down. We worked with a range of other progressives and lobby groups on that. 10 days full pay leave for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. But it's sitting there because there's no stormont to ultimately enact it. The Republic of Ireland, not as good. Work-life balance bill, looking at 5 days. But we want it to be full pay, and it's debatable about what it will be. It's a start, but it's not enough. But what I would say to you is that there's an issue between individual rights and collective interests. And unions, we see individual rights as the floor, not the ceiling. It's the minimum we should expect. We should demand a lot more. FSU, the financial union, are doing deals on domestic violence leave for workers when it comes to Danske Bank, CWU when it comes to An Post. And I think what we need to see, if we're to have a better society, a fairer society, more equality between the sexes as well, is more collective bargaining. We know that young workers, there's been a survey done in UCD, we represent about 18% of 16 to 24-year-olds. It's too low. But over 66% of 16 to 24-year-olds who aren't in a union want to be in a union. They want collectivization. So we have to work with the government and against the government when we have to make it easier for workers who want to be in a union to get that benefit. And I think if we can do that, we can have a better society and economy for all. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So we have some time for Q&A, and we also have an online audience, so there are questions here. But first, I'd like to ask if anyone has questions to please raise to our panelists. Yes. Hello.
Thank you, each of you. I suppose each of you have kind of put together aspects of a picture, and I'm also wanting to locate the policy question in the Irish context with the IMF particularly, so that we're not talking about an economic context that ignores actually some of the really fundamental policy decisions on foot of the IMF bailout and the equivalent of a structural adjustment program here that was really, I suppose, adopted very gendered policy responses. So particularly see an equivalence now with some of the data that you're talking to in the UK and the hollowing out of some of the services. So in the Irish context, you had the third sector or the equivalent that actually fills in some of the public service and the public sector supports for women, for older people, for young people, for people with disabilities, minority ethnic communities, and so on. And under the IMF bailout, a policy choice that was made was to really hollow out the funding for that entire sector. So in some instances, I think across the board, it's like 53% by 2011. In some instances, you're up to 90% of funding being cut for some of those organizations. So we're now facing some of those crises on the back of that hollowing out of a whole set of services that actually provided those kind of supports. So I don't think the policy response has really changed from that context to this current, and maybe some of you are so more located in this on a day-to-day basis might have a different perspective on that. if you ask the question about what choices we're making, so if I was to follow up with another question on that, is in whose interests are those choices that we're making? So I think that's fundamental question within I suppose, underlying a lot of those aspects. And then in the context of the strike action and collective bargaining, I'm also wondering about the position of the trade unions and the historical there with regard to social partnership and that opportunity for dialogue, I suppose, that social partnership created. You're talking about some aspects of that, but to what extent did it or did it not, I suppose, quell some of the dissent that might, and some of that propensity maybe to engage in public action and strike action. I'm not suggesting it does, it's just more of a question, not loaded. So lots of, I suppose, everything that you've said has kind of sparked lots of different ways of thinking about this. But on a very, very practical level, if I was to bring all of that back and look internally in the context of a higher education institution that also makes policy choices, that also makes particular decisions in terms of the fiscal decision making, the economic policy choices, as well as other policy choices, and the experience that you have with the gender budgeting initiatives, how might that be applied at a more micro level rather than at the macro level as well? So just interested in that aspect, and that's probably my actual question.
Are there any other questions before I select a few and then ask them? Yes.
It was just to thank you so much for a really powerful set of presentations. So just very briefly to contrast when Diane stood up to speak, and she pointed out that none of the labour market operation will work without workers, and it's the unpaid labour of often women who produce those workers. It's a very basic fact. And then we went on and talked about collective bargaining. So, I mean, I just want you to hear the reflections on just how radical a position should be taken on this unpaid labour, unseen, unpaid, behind the scenes. And if we're talking about collective bargaining, should we be talking about collective bargaining at that level too?
Hi, thanks very much. Really interesting discussions or presentations. And I suppose I just have a question about collective bargaining and poorly paid women workers, particularly migrant workers or people who can't join a union because they're isolated domestic workers, cleaners, those sort of workers. How can we reach those very marginally paid workers in Ireland?
So would you like to respond, and then I'll see if there are online questions.
So shall I respond to the question about gender budgeting at the micro level? There have been analysis of the budgets of institutions actually at all levels. I mean, some of it at the national level, which is the macroeconomic policy, but then say in the UK, you've got analysis at the devolved nations, which don't have their own central banks and which can't borrow in the way that the central government in London can borrow. So you can do, and they've done analysis in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and then it can do analysis of city budgets. And I think in some countries, I'm just trying to think, there have been some examples where you look at the budget of a university or a school. I know one of the things that came out in some of that kind of work is the money that the institution spends on sports facilities and what it spends on the sports that are mainly played by women or girls compared with the sports that are mainly played by men and boys, and then ask questions, well, oh, surprise, surprise. It seems to be we're spending a lot more money per head on the ones that are played more by men and boys. What is this a problem? What should we do about it? Surely we should have some discussion on this. So I think you can, if you basically asking what's the money, what's the revenue, where is the money going to? And is there any way we can raise more revenue or spend the money in different ways? The revenue raising is a lot more difficult, but outside the national government, because you don't have the same tax capacity that a national government has. I mean, there's very good points that Owen made about the way that employers in both in the Republic of Ireland and in the UK pay a smaller contribution than they do in European countries as an average. Obvious thing to look at, but it's only the government of Republic of Ireland or the government of the UK that can decide that. At lower tiers of governance or at specific institutions in the public sector, they can't do that. They're much more constrained about how they can raise their funding, not entirely totally without some maneuver, but much more constrained. But they have got choices to make about how they're actually going to allocate. And looking forward, you know, what's the next 5 years? How they're going to change some of the allocations so that any gender imbalances are addressed. Yeah, so I think you can use it at a more micro level.
So I'll just respond to the third sector pay and the migrant workers in sort of the invisible occupations. I totally agree though with the unpaid work. I think that is critical, especially just look at childcare. There is an assumption that, I mean, not just in Ireland, that you will go part-time if you're a mother. And like, I mean, I went part-time many years when my children were small, and that your labor will be obviously free. And that, but at some point it's the balance between the lack of income coming in because of the unpaid work and the fact that you want to be with your child, but also you want to have a fulfilling career. And I don't know the answer to it, except that I think it needs not just the standard government commission, but it needs a strategy about how, and part of that will be cheap, affordable, very localized childcare, but also greater recognition and status. I think ultimately that's what comes down to it. It's all the issues that you've raised that I was going to respond to, whether it's charity pay, which actually we're working on at task. As I speak, it's an issue that's coming up that people have approached us about, because since the financial crisis, pay in the sector has not kept pace with the demand, and increasingly just for basic needs. We did a report with the European Anti-Poverty Network about how increasingly charities are having to meet basic needs like food poverty or energy poverty, and they're poorly paid. So even Safe Ireland, like we have this training course with Safe Ireland, they can't keep staff because they're not paid well enough. And even if they're passionate about the issue, domestic violence, they have to pay the bills, going back to, or they going back to unpaid labor. Let's say they're working part-time, they're just not earning enough money in the part-time job that they have to pay for childcare. You have to pay those workers enough. But the question then is, do you unionize? Should charity sector workers unionize? And then they have a collective bargaining agreement with the government? Maybe that's the answer. And say that, listen, we need to be paid. If we're delivering essentially public services, should we be paid like a public service worker? And then should there be a collective bargaining agreement if you're doing unpaid work? We want certain privileges, the government to recognize, give us certain privileges because we are doing all this work that is affecting our career possibilities and our household income. The same thing with poorly paid migrant workers. There are actually really good examples of like the meat processing plant workers and bus drivers, where you have a very diverse membership. Well, meat processing plants, it's majority migrants. But unfortunately, it's had, it's because COVID, it made that such a visible issue. You then had SIPTU and MRC, the Migrant Rights Center, reporting to the Oireachtas that, okay, there's a real problem because people are going to work with COVID and there's not proper care being taken. So you have a high incidence of COVID or even death in that sector. Unfortunately, that's what had to happen, but it doesn't mean, I think it's very possible, I would say, to organize those workers. I don't think that's, I think that's totally within the realm of possibility. It's when they're not legally working in the country and they're being exploited because of that. That's the issue. But then that should be part of any kind of collective bargaining issue. You need to make these workers legal and they need to be paid a living wage.
I'll I'll maybe touch on the social partnership point and the migrant workers, but to general collective bargaining. First thing is, we don't want to go back to social partnership. I want to stress that. It collapsed. It was seen to be a hollow shell. The employers ran for the hills when the economic crisis happened. And if it were, and it's easy to say this in hindsight, but if it were the durable institution or entity that some people thought it was, it should have been the very vehicle that could have helped us through the collapse of the economic crisis 2008. Didn't. We don't want it. We don't want one size fits all for our membership in the public and the private sector. We do think it's eminently logical, though, that employers reach collective agreements with their employees, hence building momentum, an agreement between the public sector unions and the state, the employer, to public service workers. But in the private sector, because the sectors are so diverse, we want to see bargaining at sectoral level, and we want to see bargaining at a local level. But the real problem is this: Ireland is an outlier here. Collective bargaining is optional for employers. We either use the power of persuasion to persuade the employer if a group of workers come together and say we want collective bargaining, and say, look, it's in your interest. And if that doesn't work, we have to resort to the persuasion of power. Have a strike. That's no way to run our industrial relations in the 21st century. So we need to make collective bargaining more accessible. We need to ensure a situation that workers who want to be in a union and who want the benefits of collective bargaining can have it, and that it's not in the gift of the employer to give or not. And currently it is. And those two instruments that I mentioned, the EU directive and indeed the high-level group report, are attempts to address that. On the issue of migrant workers, big problem is our permit system. Our permit system literally bonds that migrant worker to a particular employer. And there's a caste system within the permit system. If you're a migrant worker in public service and health, it's not as bad, but it's still not good enough. And if you're in the private sector, the meat sector, it's worse. So is it any wonder that a lot of migrant workers are fearful of joining a union when the context is it's in the gift of the employer, but secondly, the permit system is as draconian as it is. So until those two issues are dealt with, but what we really ultimately want is we have social dialogue with the government. It's not as sophisticated as we'd like it to be. We would like to bargain at local level, sectoral level, and engage with the government at national level. If you look across Europe, where workers do better, where unions do better, it's happening. It's kind of what's called coordinated collective bargaining at those three levels.
Yes, there are a lot of people online, and so I want to give an opportunity to raise questions from online. One question, Diane, has been about how do we actually ensure that policymakers can increase their agency and be less restricted by central banks and decisions in multinational banks or multilateral agencies. So, because part of the problem is that policymakers are constrained. So how do we increase their agency? That's one question. And the second question is really for Shauna and Owen. And the question is how to frame the proposed constitutional referendum on women's place in the home in terms of the concept of social reproduction and care work. Because I think the referendum is just going to be only about the language around a woman's place in the home. But we haven't really talked about precisely what you're saying, the investment, the public sector investment that is needed in childcare, etc., to ensure that the women's care work is recognized. So
do we need to speak to the mic for the people on Zoom to hear us?
Probably best.
Yeah, I just wondered whether there was a mic in the room that will pick us up for the
There
online
is, I
people.
think.
There is.
Yeah, great.
I think the question that was put to me, one way to answer is in terms of the concept of fiscal space. Does the government have enough fiscal space to spend, to invest in public services, to pay the third sector, to pay the public sector workers better wages than it does? Does it have the fiscal space? And I have a two-part answer to this is some government do have the fiscal space, but they're not using it. And I think the government of the UK is one. It sounds like the government of the Republic of Ireland is another. They could raise more taxes and then they would be able to invest in the things that we need to have invested in if we're going to end this crisis of social reproduction. But that's not true of the poorest countries in the world. They don't have so much fiscal space. They have constraints if they have to borrow from the International Monetary Fund or which constrain their fiscal space. It's more difficult. It's not impossible for them to do more on in terms of raising tax revenue, but it's more difficult. And it's made more difficult by an international system which facilitates transfer of profits out of a low-income country to tax havens, to the City of London, to Luxembourg, to Barbados, to Dublin, maybe, yeah, the double Dutch, isn't it? There are all kinds of ways in which it's made harder for a government in a low-income country to stop multinational companies sending profits out of the country, and those people, the rich people in those countries, because there are rich people in all countries, the rich people in those countries sending their money out of the country. So we have to work internationally on international tax cooperation so that there isn't tax competition, she said, meaningfully looking towards Dublin in terms of who's going to have the lowest corporation rate of corporation tax. And there's also tax cooperation to plug a lot of these loopholes, which make it really hard for the government in a low-income country that might be progressive, that might be wanting to do the things we've been talking about, but it's hard for them to raise the revenue because of the way the national tax system works. So I think there's a lot there we can do, but it needs international cooperation to do that. And actually the woman who is the Prime Minister in Barbados is doing she's doing a great job at the moment in trying to bring people together both in the Western Hemisphere and also internationally to look at these issues and to try and put forward proposals for an international financial system, international tax cooperation that will mean there is more agency for policymakers who are constrained at the moment, but who would like to have good policies to address the cost of living crisis. That's true, but we shouldn't let governments in the UK and the Republic of Ireland off the hook because they have got more fiscal capacity. They're just choosing not to use it.
Thank you, Diane. Quick response, Shauna and Owen, to the question about the constitutional referendum, because people do need to go. We're 10 minutes over.
It will be a quick response. I think this will be because I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about. I think there's a question of removing the language in the Constitution, which is right. And then there's a separate issue about all of the public services. And I think that is goes beyond just having another citizens assembly and another recommendation for a referendum. I think actually that has to be a very public push to accelerate the commitments that the government has already made in terms of the first 5 strategy. So I'm not sure I would situate that within the framework of discussing the Constitution itself. I think that it's more of a policy issue that needs to be addressed urgently.
Owen?
Nothing really to add to what Shanna said there.
Well, I mean, the one takeaway for me from this discussion has been the importance of investment in social reproduction infrastructure, not just the roads, but social reproduction infrastructure. And we have to actually press our governments to do more because they can do more. And it is only with adequate and sustained investment in the social reproduction infrastructure that we would actually ensure that what those women fought for in the late 19th, early 20th century would actually realize, because economic security cannot be guaranteed without adequate social reproduction infrastructure. So thank you so much. And there is food outside and a chance to just interact with Diane and Shauna